when it came to the test pilots at Rechlin, they gave the 112 the better report, considerably better over the 109. But Udet decided that he was under pressure to produce numbers of aircraft rather than quality. And he realized, quite rightly, that the 109 was far easier to produce in numbers than the 112. Basically because the undercarriage on the 109 was an integral part of the fuselage. So the fuselage and the wings could be produced separately and then joined at a later date.
Willy Messerschmitt's fabled Bf-109 was manufactured in greater numbers than any other production aircraft. Almost 34,000 were built. Usually referred to as the Me-109, at the time the aircraft was conceived, it was designated the Bf-109. B because the maker was located in Bavaria, and F because the company was called Flugwerk. It was only when Willy Messerschmitt gained full control of the company that the Me prefix was assigned. Throughout the 30s and during the Second World War, Willy Messerschmitt endured a dogged relationship with Erhard Milch, who had gained high position with the fledgling state airline Lufthansa and later with the German Air Ministry, more often known as the RLM. A close friend of Milch was killed piloting a Messerschmitt-designed transport plane, the M-20, on its first flight. Milch was to blame Messerschmitt over the accident, a grudge that was to last for years. Fortunately, Messerschmitt had cultivated a relationship with Hermann Göring, who ultimately became Milch's superior. To get his first Luftwaffe fighter contract, Messerschmitt's Bf-109 had to compete with an advanced Heinkel design, the HE-112. In the end, the competition was won by the 109, and a legend was born. The 109 first saw service in Spain. Along with other modern German aircraft like the Stuka, the 109 was tested in actual combat conditions. The lessons gained would later be applied to a much larger conflict in the skies over Britain. In Spain, it became clear that the 109 lacked range and endurance. Its slender lines made for greater speed, but left little space for fuel. One possible solution to this problem was to use the Bf-110 to tow the smaller 109 to the combat area, thus preserving its limited fuel for fighting. Novel though the idea was, the towing technique proved impractical for all but glider warfare. However, a few years later, when Germany was suffering from the relentless heavy bombing of the US 8th Air Force, the 109 was employed as a test aircraft in towing a unique glider fighter concept offered by the Blum and Voss company. The BV-40 was a very low-cost fighter glider that would have been coupled to a Bf-109. When the tiny Blum and Voss design was in a position above the American bombers, it was released to attack them, using its two 30mm cannons and their limited stock of ammunition. The BV-40 was so small its pilot had to lie on a mattress in a prone position. However, the BV-40 relied upon its diminutive size to avoid US gunners. Only 7 BV-40s were built before the project was abandoned, probably because the Me-163 was a slightly more practical and self-contained concept. 109s were also pressed into service for clandestine missions, dropping spies and saboteurs behind enemy lines. Special capsules could be attached to both wings, each containing a single parachutist. An often overlooked feature of the 109 was its system of leading-edge slats on the forward surface of the wings, These made for better handling and shorter takeoffs. Interestingly, the concept had been developed and patented by the British Hanley Page Company, and Messerschmitt had to pay for the use of the invention. The slats proved so successful that they were also used in Messerschmitt's 410 and legendary 262 jet fighter. The 262 had another link to the Bf 109, owing to the fact that the jet's nose wheel assembly is actually a single main wheel strut from the Bf 109's narrow gate undercarriage. The 109's narrow gate undercarriage was always a challenge when it came to landing or takeoff, even under normal conditions. At one point in the war, the Kriegsmarine had high hope for its sole aircraft carrier, the Zeppelin. It was always assumed that the Zeppelin would be equipped with Stukas and 109s. The Stuka's wide-gate undercarriage would have been suitable for aircraft carrier landings, but the standard 109 arrangement was not. Accordingly, Messerschmitt set to work to modify the wings so that the wheels could function in a more stable wide-gate fashion. This aircraft was designated the Me 155. The Zeppelin never put to sea, and the 155 was abandoned, only to be later resurrected by the Blohm & Voss company as a very high-altitude fighter concept. But this came too late to help an ailing Germany. Messerschmitt followed the 109 with the Bf 110. Although this later became successful in several other roles, it was never suitable for the long-range bomber escort mission. Messerschmitt quickly offered the 210 as an alternative. But this proved to be a failure, and so the Me 410 was rushed into development. As a precaution, in 1942, the company was ordered to develop a backup aircraft based on existing 109 parts, and using two fuselages, which enabled the creation of a totally new aircraft employing a minimum number of new parts. The Me 109Z Zilling was made as a single-seat, very long-range, heavy fighter. It might have shown great promise if the two prototypes had not been badly damaged in an Allied bombing raid. This loss demonstrated that Germany needed a homeland defender more than a bomber escort at this stage of the war. In addition, the Me 262 jet was close to delivery, and this groundbreaking design could have been a real game-changer if they had arrived in time. Possible proof of the Me 109Z's viability came with the US North American P-82 twin Mustang. Independently, the German designer of the P-82 chose to follow exactly the same approach as the Me 109Z. 270 twin Mustangs were actually produced and served in Korea and the United States as night fighters. In another pairing, Bf 109s were flown with other aircraft during the Mistral missions. These occurred when Germany's fortunes were declining and the Wehrmacht were looking to develop a new type of flying bomb. The concept would use a disposable unmanned bomber filled with explosives, but guided by a piloted 109. Gliders were first used to prove this concept, but eventually two-engine bombers were employed. The Bf 109 was produced in greater numbers than any aircraft in history. It served the Luftwaffe and other air forces well, and it proved more than an adequate fighter for Germany until it was supplanted by the FW-190. Even then, it remained in active service and production until the end of the war. The Bf 109 was one of aviation's great planes.
An emergency command was given, and the German pilots grabbed their helmets and goggles and rushed to their aircraft. Unteroffizier Heinz Orlowski fastened his parachute and hurled himself aboard White 1.
We started from the island of Hertie at approximately 4 p.m. Our assignment was to protect a German convoy from attacks by British bombers and fighters. We started with 12 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. In addition to myself, there were 8 comrades from my own wing and approximately 4 others from the 12th Fighter Wing.
When I heard that Heinz was going to come over and see his airplane, I thought that it's going to preserve a piece of history that could very easily be forgotten. And of course, over the years, I've seen him every year, and he has mellowed. And but the first time I asked him if he would come over and look at his airplane, he said no. He was shot down on the 9th of February 1945 by 2 English Mustangs. And as far as I know, he has not seen the aircraft since. But at the time we started the project, there were only 5 Focke-Wulfs, radial engine Focke-Wulfs left in the world. This, to me, is incredible, considering that there were over 20,000 Focke-Wulfs built. And this was the first-line fighter for Germany. Being a historian, I'm interested in how people felt and what actually happened. I feel like that the Germans are very afraid to save or preserve anything from World War II. It's very hard for a German to talk about the war because the German soldier, the German pilot like Orlowski, wasn't involved in the politics. They were young, they were 18, they were told that their country needed them. They fought very hard for their country. They lost. They felt like they did their best. They don't feel like they need to apologize to anybody.
Vor einem Jahr habe ich versprochen, dass ich nach hier komme. Was? Ja. Ich habe mein Wort gehalten. Jetzt bin ich hier. Du wolltest das so haben.
I have to greet you too. Yes.
Heinz Orlowski, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot, is reunited with his Focke-Wulf 190 White 1. Not since February the 9th, 1945, when 2 British Mustangs shot down White 1 and sent Orlowski free-falling with no parachute, have plane and pilot been together. Today, nearly 50 years later, they find themselves together in a small South Texas town, deep in the heart of the Rio Grande Valley, a place where thousands of acres of land are planted each year and where some aviators make their living crop dusting. After he parks his air tractor, John Houston walks next door to help coordinate the efforts of the Texas Air Museum. Houston, who once served as a private pilot for another Texan named Lyndon Johnson, convinced the museum to try to acquire a Focke-Wulf 190.
We originally started the museum on Vietnam, and we were having extreme difficulty in getting any items from the government. So it was either close up the museum or branch out into other areas. And we decided that a 190 was the rarest plane from World War II, and so we set out to get one.
The museum discovered that the Norwegian government had in its possession 3 recently recovered FW-190s. A deal was struck, and the museum agreed to restore all of the aircraft and keep White 1 in Texas.
Planes were flown over in a Norwegian C-130, and they started arriving in '86, and we're restoring 4 aircraft.
Restoration of the plane involved extensive research, and soon it was uncovered that White 1's last pilot was still living in Berlin.
We found out that he was living in Berlin, found someone that could speak German, and got a Berlin phone book, and about the 3rd call, they got one of Orlovsky's relatives. In 1988, I went to Linköping, Sweden, to the museum there, and called Heinz and told him that I wanted to come to Berlin and talk to him. And he asked me when I would be in Berlin, and I told him the next morning. And he said, well, you can come at 2 o'clock and you can stay until 3. And so I arrived at 2 o'clock, and we sat and we talked, and he looked up when it was 3 o'clock and he said, would you like to stay till it's 4? And I said yes. And at 4 o'clock, he said, would you like to have supper? And so that's how we met and got acquainted.
From that first meeting, a friendship was made between these 2 men that has transcended age, language, and history. The story of Heinz Orlovsky and his aircraft White 1 provides a special look into a young pilot's journey through the war, piloting the Luftwaffe's most advanced fighter aircraft. Both the aircraft and pilot entered the war at the height of Hitler's conquest and exited together after being dramatically separated in the sky, defending a dying cause.
An diesem Ding bin ich bald hängen geblieben und dann lebte ich heute nicht mehr. Das ist eine Brechkupplung.
The First World War left Germany devastated. Not only were cities and villages destroyed, the entire political and economic infrastructure of German society was left in shambles. There was no food for children. The few rations available were distributed through Allied supply lines. These bitter realities left lasting impressions in the minds of Germany's children. After the First World War, the world journeyed to Louis XIV's summer home in Versailles to settle the peace. The Treaty of Versailles held Germany and her allies responsible for the hostilities and required the Germans to pay reparations totaling $33 billion. The blame for the war and the demand for reparations caused great bitterness among the German people. Economic problems resulting from the Great Depression of 1929 only added to their frustrations. This was the world as Heinz Orlovsky knew it. His father had fought in the First World War, and as a young man, Heinz learned firsthand of the great divide Germany experienced between the wars, a time of uncertainty and defiance. This would change after Adolf Hitler came into power. Under Hitler's leadership, Germany would return to the glory he felt she deserved by becoming a great military power. German society was systematically mobilized to an unprecedented degree. The creation of Hitler's Luftwaffe was the crowning pinnacle of this achievement. As early as 1935, Hitler had begun to defy the Treaty of Versailles by building an air fleet capable of, as he once proclaimed, putting a steel roof over Germany and darkening out the sun. Calculated factory output of military aircraft increased, and by the eve of the war, Hitler commanded a fleet of over 4,000 all-metal combat aircraft. Hitler now needed people to run his war machine. Extensive propaganda was his weapon for winning support. These young boys would soon become young men. And for the adolescent, Hitler also had a plan. The German youth would contribute to the national cause by assisting with a number of public works projects. Roads needed to be repaired, ditches needed to be dug, and fences needed to be built. Participants in Hitler's youth movement were often paraded through towns and communities, setting an example for the local youth. With his military machine in place, Hitler began his war in September 1939, when German forces under the protection of the Luftwaffe marched into Poland. The world was shocked by the awesome military power of the Third Reich. Honoring diplomatic agreements, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany, and the Second World War began. But the Allied problems were only beginning. 9 months after his invasion of Poland, Hitler marched his army almost unopposed towards Paris. Like a well-orchestrated machine, the German forces were virtually unstoppable. The resistance put forth by the French and British forces was no match. Upon receiving news that the French had decided to concede instead of risking the destruction of Paris, Hitler was so thrilled he could barely contain himself. At elaborately staged peace negotiations, Paris was declared an open city on June 13, 1940. And 3 days later, the Germans arrived in the French capital. At the time of the German invasion into France, Heinz Orlowski was an apprentice at a sawmill. Like many of the young workers, he knew the war would soon change his life. In November of 1941, Heinz received a letter from the German government calling him into the army. 1 month later, Heinz volunteered into the Luftwaffe. As a young boy, Heinz had always been fascinated with aircraft. The Luftwaffe was his chance to learn how to fly. The Luftwaffe was very selective. They had many volunteers and were able to pick only the very best. Candidates had to pass many tests, and there was a fair rate of attrition. The Luftwaffe also enjoyed a special status in the Reich. Hitler knew future wars would be won in the air. He needed the best young men the fatherland offered. Heinz's chance to learn how to fly improved after he qualified to join a prospective fighter battalion in France. About the time Heinz was becoming a new fighter pilot, the Luftwaffe was also getting a new fighter aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190. The FW-190 became the Luftwaffe's greatest fighter aircraft, with over 20,000 units produced. The famous German aircraft designer Kurt Tank was responsible for the FW-190. Tank's task involved designing an aircraft that could use the readily available radial engine in a fighter aircraft to serve as a backup to the renowned Me-109. There were a few pre-war fighter aircraft designed with a radial engine. The United States Navy favored a Pratt & Whitney radial engine because it was more reliable and took up less space on an aircraft carrier. In the early 1930s, a number of these American engines made their way to Germany, and eventually BMW obtained permission to manufacture the radial engine. Tank brilliantly designed a metal cowl with modern safety features, and by early 1939, the jigs and tools were in place for mass production of the FW-190. The Germans saw the advantage of using subcontractors, each one responsible for turning out large numbers of specific parts. Parts for the FW-190 came from at least 24 different places of production. In August 1941, the 26th Squadron became the first fighter unit to receive the new FW-190s. The new fighter's first major assignment was to defend the two German capital ships, the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, as they made a mad dash back to Germany via the English Channel. This daring operation was Hitler's doing. He knew the risk involved, but he strongly believed a successful pass through the Channel would throw a tremendous psychological blow on the British. Brilliant coordination between the Luftwaffe and the German Navy put a shield around the capital ships and allowed them to return home safely. The FW-190s contributed greatly to the cause, and word of Germany's new fighter spread. Heinz learned of the FW-190's success while soaring across the sky in sophisticated training gliders. The Germans had begun secretly training their pilots during the late 1930s. Flying a glider provided extensive understanding of aerodynamics. They were far less expensive to operate than powered aircraft, perfect for young and inexperienced pilots. By March of 1943, Heinz had logged over 81 takeoffs in a variety of different gliders. After he received his glider pilot certificate, he was transferred to East Prussia for further flight training. The war around Heinz was growing closer. Hitler had overextended himself, and gradually the Allies began turning the direction of the war in their favor. Responding to this, Hitler made more demands on his people and the people he had conquered. As Heinz traveled across his country, he witnessed the peculiar situation German society was experiencing. Troops moved rapidly in and out of cities, and security became an integral part of daily life. Even more disheartening was the great exodus from the cities. As Allied bombers began pinpointing areas throughout Germany, massive evacuations were ordered, and those told to leave their homes had no choice but to do so. Women and children were sent away first. For many Germans, the war was not as promised. Once in East Prussia, Heinz began to learn how to fly a number of powered aircraft, including the Focke-Wulf FW-56 Stosser and the Messerschmitt Bf 109. The Bf 109 was the pride of the Luftwaffe, and Heinz was thrilled to be flying the aircraft. In a short time, Heinz had come a long way from his apprenticeship at the sawmill. Fortunately for Heinz, an emergency landing due to equipment failure was not fatal. In July, he received his Air Force pilot certificate. In August of 1943, Heinz returned to France to continue advanced fighter training. The thrill of flying was becoming more intertwined with the realities of the war. For the next few months, Heinz could only wonder where, upon completion of this last stage of training, he might be assigned. Heinz's anxiety concerning where he might be stationed was further complicated after the Allies launched Operation Overlord. After months of preparation, a huge Allied force consisting of predominantly American, British, Canadian, and French troops landed on the 5 beaches at Normandy. The Allied landing was supported by bombers and fighters, which vigorously attacked enemy positions and supply lines. Beachheads were established, and more soldiers and supplies made their way onto French soil. In less than a month after D-Day, there were over 1 million Allied soldiers in France. D-Day caught the Germans by surprise. Hitler knew a second front was inevitable, but he had no idea where it might occur. While Normandy was a consideration, it was hardly anticipated. Less than a month after the D-Day invasion, Heinz Orlowski was sent to Finland and assigned to the 5th Fighter Squadron known as the Ice Hunters. Much like what was happening in the West, Hitler's Eastern campaign was also in desperate need of fighter pilots. The Russians' push toward Berlin had left the ill-supplied German army with no choice but to pull back. During this retreat, supplies and soldiers made the journey across Finland and boarded ships to bring them south. Heinz's squadron was responsible for providing protection for the retreating German forces. On September 2, 1944, Heinz flew his first FW-190. 3 weeks later, one day before his 21st birthday, Heinz Orlowski experienced his first alarm takeoff in a confrontation against Russian fighters and bombers. The German conflict with Russia was complicated by the fact that the Russian fighter aircraft outnumbered the Germans 12-1. Heinz's squadron was forced to conduct around-the-clock sorties. This was difficult for Heinz because there was no time for the experienced pilots to offer advice. Instead, he had to learn by doing. By November 1, 1944, Heinz had flown in 20 combat flights. Heinz was then transferred to the newly organized 9th Squadron of the Ice Hunters in Norway. The primary task of the squadron was to protect the fleet that was escorting the great ship, the Tirpitz. It was here that Heinz and White One came together. Hitler had stationed over 300,000 troops in Norway for the duration of the war. Norway is the zone of destiny in this war, he declared in January 1942. With little regard to the welfare of the Norwegians, Hitler had tried to establish the foundations for his Northern Empire. The Norwegian coast was a critical component in Germany's access to international waters. "Every ship that is not stationed in Norway is in the wrong place," he once told the naval commander, Admiral Raeder. Upon completion, the great German capital ship Tirpitz was ordered to Norway. When launched in 1939, the Tirpitz was one of the most fearsome ships in the world. Her 42,500-ton displacement was greater than any other ship afloat. Turbines were capable of 163,000 horsepower and could drive the ship at 31.1 knots. The four main turrets housed 8 long-barreled 15-inch guns, whose 1,760-pound shells could penetrate 13 inches of armor plate from a distance of 22 miles. Yet during the war, the Tirpitz earned the nickname the Lonely Queen, for she was never given a chance to prove herself. While sequestered in Norway, she made only one major sortie, yet her mere presence irritated the British. It was an honor to defend such an important component of the Reich. Beginning in 1942, the British made 20 attempts to sink the Tirpitz. The Germans kept moving the ship deeper inside Norway's heavily guarded fjords. In the fall of 1944, the British would achieve ultimate success. Before dawn on November 12, 1944, the Tirpitz and her crew lay hidden along the Norwegian coast. Only a few miles away, Heinz Orlovsky was awake with his squadron waiting. Less than an hour away, flying in ideal weather conditions, were 31 British Lancasters heading directly for the Tirpitz. The British bombers had flown all night, and by dawn they were over Norway. Heinz's squadron had been alerted to reports of enemy aircraft heading their way. There was nothing to do but wait until the bombers were sighted. Finally, the attack began, and orders were given to scramble the fighters. But the order came too late, for by the time Heinz's squadron reached the Tirpitz, 2 Lancasters had already successfully dropped special tallboy bombs capable of penetrating the ship's armor. Heinz and White One could do nothing but watch the Tirpitz burn and then disappear. Hitler ordered the remaining Northern Fleet, along with the fighter aircraft, to be sent to Finland in support of the eastern retreat. The movement of the German fleet along the Norwegian coast provided the RAF with opportunities to attack the remaining ships. While they were in transit to Finland, Heinz and his comrades of the Ice Hunter Squadron were to protect the remaining fleet from British attacks. It was under these circumstances that the great Norwegian air battle now known as Black Friday occurred. Early morning on February 9, 1945, the Germans learned that the British had sent 2 Bofighters on a reconnaissance mission over Norway. The 2 Bofighters found a number of merchant vessels, minesweepers, and the destroyer Z-33. The navigators quickly sent their findings to operations. At 13:55, Bofighters formed up to launch a major strike against the vessels reported by the reconnaissance patrol. They were escorted by Mustang fighter pilots who were Norwegian, used because of their knowledge of the coastline. At the Herdia airport, Heinz Orlovsky waited anxiously with his comrades of the 5th Squadron for the impending British strike. They'd seen the 2 British reconnaissance planes and knew that they'd been identified, located, and that the Royal Air Force was probably on the way. Finally, it came. An emergency command was given, and the German pilots grabbed their helmets and goggles and rushed to their aircraft. Unteroffizier Heinz Orlowski fastened his parachute and hurled himself aboard White 1.
We started from the island of Hertia at approximately 4 p.m. Our assignment was to protect a German convoy from attacks by British bombers and fighters. We started with 12 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. In addition to myself, there were 8 comrades from my own wing and approximately 4 others from the 12th Fighter Wing. We arrived in time and a big air battle developed. Our Norwegian friends told me this was one of the biggest air battles over their area.
A Norwegian schoolteacher who had sensed an air raid and sent her students home early remembered hearing an unusually deep boom from the southwest. The Norwegians were used to the roar of planes, but this was different, and it grew stronger. The planes were sighted, and the ships opened fire at once. The British had hoped for a surprise attack, but this time Heinz and his comrades knew they were coming. The German fighters were spotted on the horizon, and the fight intensified as each pilot fought for survival.
Ich bin von dem großen Verband abgekommen.
I strayed from the main air battle and headed in a southerly direction while giving chase to a bullfighter.
Heinz pursued the Bowfighter, and after a dramatic chase, he sent the bomber into the mountains. 2 Mustangs, too late to help the bomber, gave chase after Heinz.
At this point, my fight for survival began in earnest, by myself against the Mustangs. During the ensuing dogfight, I shot and damaged 1 Mustang. While I was looking to see if it was hit or not, another one hit me. I never saw the fire, but I could smell the smoke. And I heard the explosion. Cautiously, so I wouldn't get shot again, I pulled my airplane up as far as I could. Then I pushed her down slightly, disengaged the canopy, unstrapped myself, and was pulled upwards out of it. The headwind was so strong that I was unable to move my hand to release the parachute. We had never before trained how to get out with a parachute, so I really did not know what would happen. Eventually, I was able to get a hold of the parachute release. However, it didn't open totally. On the way down, the parachute above me looked like a loose sack.
The deep snow softened Heinz's impact, but his signal pistol discharged and injured his foot. Some Norwegians who'd seen the plane crash headed up the mountain to look for survivors.
I was taken to the hospital in Fjord. There were also Allied airmen. I went over to them bracing myself on a broom because of my bad leg, and shared my cigarettes and chocolate.
The war was over for Heinz. And in only a few more months, the war was over for everybody. The announcement of Germany's surrender came on May 8. Like most German Luftwaffe personnel, Heinz Orlowski was forbidden to serve in the military and forbidden to fly. He was 22 years old and out of work. Hitler's great Luftwaffe was grounded. Never again would the sound of bomber and fighter engines of the Third Reich fill the European skies. Many of the German aircraft were either destroyed or booby-trapped by the Germans. Some that survived were studied by Allied engineers. Others ended up like White One, cold and in pieces, spread across a Norwegian mountain, waiting for someone to put her back together. Harlingen, Texas. World War II has been over for 50 years. It's hard to imagine what Kurt Tank would have thought had you told him that one of his aircraft, 50 years after its last flight, would end up being restored in a small town in South Texas. But restoration of historical aircraft takes place all over the world, and it usually falls in the hands of those who are driven by a passion for aviation. John Huston, crop duster, is more passionate than most. Huston and the many volunteers at the Texas Air Museum were diligent in their efforts to secure a Focke-Wulf 190. After contacting numerous countries involved in the Second World War, Huston and his colleagues learned the Norwegian government was looking for people to restore 3 FW-190s they'd recently recovered. It was a perfect agreement, for Huston and his colleagues were capable of undertaking the restoration, and the Norwegians were willing to reward them for their efforts.
The Norwegian government had 3 wrecks. 2 of them they had already brought into their museum at Gardermoen, and the 3rd one was still at the crash site. And it was determined that we could rebuild, restore 2 of the Focke-Wulf 190s, and 1 would go back to Norway. And later on, they found some more wreckage, and they gave that to us. Which built the collection up to 4 aircraft. The planes were in poor condition. First of all, it had crashed and was basically broken into 4 pieces, broke basically in the cockpit area. And it was brought into the museum in 1985, so it laid out on the battlefield from 1945 till 1985. And one of the things that happened that we didn't realize was that the Germans, up until the last 2 weeks of the war, had recovery teams that went out and took parts that they needed to supply the other aircraft. Like this wing right here, there was a flat motor here, and they took an axe and they chopped it out. And finally got to meet someone that was on a recovery team, and I said, "Why'd you use an axe? Why didn't you just take it out?" And he said it was 55 below zero. So they went out, they did the job they had to do as quick as possible and tried to get back where it was warm. It's taken us about 50,000 man-hours per airplane to restore.
With White 1 restored and safely tucked away in a hangar, all that remained was an historic pilot-plane reunion.
Heinz coming here means a great deal in many respects. One is it gives us something to show the children. It's created better relationships. I think that he has a lot better feeling towards Americans now, and we hope that this story will help give Heinz a better picture.
Sich ein großer Wunsch erfüllt.
One of my biggest wishes has been fulfilled. For many years I have tried to be united with my airplane. I have waited much too long. That is why I had to travel by commercial airplane all the way to Texas. What am I feeling? I'm deeply touched. It is a strange feeling. A piece of technology and a human being meet after 49 years.
Originally viewed as a backup fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190 became the Luftwaffe's premier fighter aircraft. Her speed, maneuverability, and heavy armor left her revered by pilots on both sides of the war. Today, White 1 is one of the few remaining FW-190s and is the only aircraft to be reunited with her old pilot. When he was separated in the sky from White 1, Heinz Orlowski never dreamed he would see his plane again. But thanks to the efforts of many, the two shared a more appropriate farewell.
And there's a relationship between a man and an airplane. And the only way I know how to describe it is when you're flying and you're in control of everything. The airplane and the pilot is one. And there are airplanes that when you get in and fly, it's like an extension of your body. And the Focke-Wulf was a true breakthrough in aviation. Heinz had to have that relationship because it was more or less an extension of his body.
We flew against another's airplane and he flew against us. So we sat inside machines and the machines fought each other. Face to face, we would probably have shaken hands. At least I think so after meeting the British, the French and the American. After the war was over, I tried to foster understanding between our former enemies and ourselves. I did this because I knew that they felt exactly the same way.
Das ist schwer zu vermitteln.
This experience is difficult to pass on to the next generation. But it is the reason why I am so involved in this. It is so important that they understand how stupid it is when people who could be friends are sent to kill each other by some madman. Whether it is Hitler or someone else does not matter at all.
Well, to me, there was a lot of apprehension when he first got here and not knowing what to expect. But when he sat down in the airplane, you could see his mind drift back in time. And that to me is what made it.
Und wenn man hier sitzt, dann denkt man,
Both of us are worse for the wear, but we have survived the war.
was erlebt hat. Ich denke
And as I sit here,
den sinnlosen
I recall those days and remember
deutschen Kameraden.
I remember the senseless deaths of German comrades,
Tod von vielen Engländern,
but also the
Kanadiern,
British,
Australiern.
Canadian, and Australian soldiers
Nicht das Glück hatten,
who were not as fortunate to survive
den Krieg zu
the
überleben.
war as I have.
For more amazing aerial footage and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel,